Professor Tan Chai, President of the National University of Singapore, Professor Wang Gungwu, University Professor at the National University of Singapore, Professor Yaqub Ibrahim, Professor at the Singapore Institute of Technology and Chair of the Syed Hussein Alatas Memorial Lecture Advisory Committee, Associate Professor Mazna Muhammad, Head of the Department of Malay Studies, distinguished guests, esteemed alumni, university colleagues and friends, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Hanisa Abdullah Sani, and I am truly honored to serve as the MC for the event this afternoon. A very warm welcome, salam dan selamat petang to everyone in the audience and on Zoom on this special occasion today as we commemorate the 4th Syed Hussein Alatas Memorial Lecture. We are happy to be back this year in person, even if in a hybrid setting, to remember and celebrate the late Syed Hussein Alatas' remarkable scholarship and the vast contribution he has made to intellectual life within the university, but also, and perhaps more enduringly, as the eminent public intellectual that he was, for the influence of his ideas in the region and beyond. This year, we are exceptionally delighted to have no other than esteemed Professor Wang Gungwu to reflect on the life and mission of the late Alatas and to deliver the 4th memorial lecture entitled Nation Building as a Civilizing Mission. Without further ado, let me first invite Associate Professor Mazna Muhammad, Head of the Department of Malay Studies, to introduce Professor Wang and for her welcoming remarks. Prof. Mazna, please.
Distinguished speaker for today's lecture, Professor Wang Gungwu, President of NUS, Professor Tan Chai, Chairperson of the Syed Hussein Memorial Lecture Advisory Committee, Professor Yaqub Ibrahim, and members of his committee, namely Professor Syed Farid Alatas, Associate Professor Nur Aisha Abdul Rahman, Dr. Nur Sharil Saad, and Mr. Idris Surati, my honored colleagues, treasured alumni and students of the Department of Malay Studies, esteemed guests, ladies and gentlemen. A very good afternoon to you. I wish you all a warm welcome to this annual lecture series organized by the Malay Studies Department. And on behalf of the department, we are really heartened by your support and presence, especially to be able to do so physically today. So as Dr. Hanisa has said earlier, this memorial lecture series was established to honor the legacy of the late Professor Syed Hussein Alatas, who was appointed to the Foundation Chair of Malay Studies at the then University of Singapore in 1967. Professor Alatas served as head of the department till 1987. So this memorial lecture series was established to honor the legacy of the late Professor Alatas, who was, this is an annual series which the department proudly organizes. It aims to invite distinguished scholars, public intellectuals, and thought leaders from around the world to present their speech related to the scholarly contribution made by the late Professor Alatas. Through this event, we continue the vibrant intellectual discourse and vigorous scholarship on society and systems grounded by Professor Alatas. Professor Alatas's personality, his speech, and his writings continue till the present time to set the tone for the study of the Malay world, its people, and its interconnections with the global community. This year, we are extremely proud and honored to have one of Asia's most prominent and erudite scholars, Professor Wang Gungwu, to continue this tradition of intellectual engagement around the iconic ideas, activity, and legacy of the late Syed Hussein Alatas. Thank you, Professor Wang, for your graciousness in accepting our invitation to do so here today. In this welcoming speech, let me take the opportunity to thank many parties for their generosity and belief in the cause of advancing scholarship in studies of the Malay world. Firstly, our benefactor, the Jalil Foundation, which made it possible to convene this memorial lecture series on an unbroken annual basis for the 4th time. Secondly, the department thanks Professor Yaacob Ibrahim for playing a pivotal role in securing the foundation's support for this lecture series and his continuing generosity towards serving the organization of today's event. Thirdly, Associate Professor Nur Aisha Abdurrahman, who deserves special mention for laying down the conceptual purpose of this project and who worked very hard to secure the contribution of our donor for this annual lecture series. So once again, to the Syed Hussein Alatas Memorial Lecture Advisory Committee, chaired by Professor Yaacob Ibrahim, thank you for steering the committee splendidly, culminating in today's gathering. Although there's so few of us in this hall, but I'd like to assure you there was so much organization involved in putting together this event today. And we're very proud to be able to do so for Professor Wang Gungwu's lecture. I also like to thank the Alumni Office of the Shaw Foundation Building for providing the use of this auspicious hall. And yes, we are extremely pleased with the presence of President Tan Eng Chai at this event today. Thank you, Professor Tan, for this honor of your support for this occasion. It means a lot for the lecture series. Once again, I cannot thank enough our distinguished speaker, Professor Wang. Many, many thank yous. Undoubtedly, your speech will be sure to generate thoughtful questions, meaningful dialogue, and spirited discussions that will long remain in our hearts and memory. Thank you very much, and a warm welcome to all of you again. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Masna. As is the usual convention, we follow with poetry recitation. This year is slightly special because instead of a sajak, as in previous years, we are treated to a different genre of Malay poetry, this time the Pantun Berkait, composed by our resident scholar and poet, Dr. Azhar Ibrahim. The Pantun Berkait, entitled Pantun Cita Berjuang, the English translation reads, The Struggle for Aspiration, will be recited by Saudari Nur Hikmah Muhammad Ali, an honors year student at the Department of Malay Studies. Saudari.
Ladies and gentlemen, pantun or kontren is a popular poetic expression in the Malay world. It is recited during formal occasions, inasmuch as it is an intimate conversation between two people. Pantun Juang Bercita. Salam hormat hadirin budiman, Presiden NUS Profesor Tan Eng Chai dalam barisan. Tetamu hadirin bistari ilmuwan, selamat datang ke kuliah tahunan. Kuliah diseri ucapan perdana Profesor Wang Gungwu, sahabat lama, dengan almarhum Alatas berjuang sama kepada Tuan Profesor, tabik kami semua. Aku bermimpi main seruling, hadapan bunga, tepian kolam. Biarkan aku rebah terguling, asal bangsaku tidak tenggelam. Puan-tuan, itulah pantun terlanggam, hasil lantunan Profesor Alatas. Padat pesan, mudah terpaham, kiasan pantun jarang terlepas. Seri majlis kuliah kenangan, izinkan pantun mula lafazan. Kalau ada tersalah umpamaan, 1000 maaf kami mohonkan. Tanah Nusa Samudra Gunungan, tempat berdagang nahoda seberang. Kenang-kenangan tokoh ilmuwan, setahun sekali kita berkampungan. Tempat berdagang nahoda seberang, Selat Melaka, perahu berlayar. Syed Hussein Alatas, ilmuwan terbilang, itulah guru tempat belajar. Selat Melaka, perahu berlayar, syarat muatan jong dan kapal. Menabuh ilmu tiada terbayar, budi mutuan terusnya kekal. Syarat muatan jong dan kapal, rempah ratus berpikul-pikul. Ilmu berakal, penawar bebal, fikiran tertawan, jangan berkaul. Rempah ratus berpikul-pikul, jadi rebutan dagangan luar. Jangan cepat gendang memukul, kalau rancangan rapuh terbiar. Jadi rebutan dagangan luar, mulalah kuasa tamak menakluk. Nasib rakyat bila dibiar, bencana dan rasuah dibelok-belok. Mulalah kuasa tamak menakluk, itulah penjajah bertaring terkam. Kalau ilmuwan moralnya teruk, pastilah masyarakat sungguh terjunam. Itulah penjajah bertaring terkam. Syukurlah zaman sudah berlalu. Negara bangsa sudah teridam. Juang ilmuwan mesti terpadu. Syukurlah zaman sudah berlalu. Awas-awasan minda tertawan. Harus digerak manusia baru agar kemanusiaan ubur pencerahan. Awas-awasan minda tertawan. Jangan sampai ilmu bencana. Akal dan moral jadi pedoman. Maruah berdiri, hidup berbangsa. Sekian cukup pantun lantunan dari kami sekadar renungan. Izinkan disemat pantun akhiran, ilham almarhum gema pesanan. Laung suara tiada hentinya, hendakkan bangsa gagah dan maju. Sungguh pun mesra semak ertinya, jangan biasa salah teraju. Inilah pantun gubahan kami, Dr. Azhar Ibrahim empunya ilhami. Saya yang melantun, Nur Hikmah Muhammad Ali. Terima kasih hadirin yang mendengar berhati. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nur Hikmah. We now come to the much-awaited segment of our program, that is the memorial lecture. The lecture will be followed by a question and answer session, and since this is a hybrid format, we will be taking questions both from the floor as well as on Zoom. For those tuning in online, just a small reminder to please do send in your questions as the lecture is being delivered via the Q&A function on Zoom. We would now like to invite Professor Wang Gungwu to deliver his address. Professor Wang, please.
Thank you very much for coming along. It has made this a very special day for me because this is the first time I've actually appeared in an in-person gathering like this. So I feel particularly honored and feel very pleased and happy and delighted to be with you. I thank the organizers for inviting me to give this fourth Syed Hussein Alatas Memorial Lecture. It is an honor that I accepted with great hesitation. I had attended the inaugural lecture given by Chandra Muzaffar. Chandra obviously shared the global perspectives that marked Hussein's approach to the study of state and society, past and present. And he had thoroughly explored the same range of ideas that Hussein had done. Since then, I have learned more about Hussein's work and followed several programs that deal with his contributions. That has made me realize how much I did not know about Hussein, even at a time when he and I had our University of Malaya conversations in the early 1960s. Hussein and I parted when he went to Singapore and I went to Canberra, where my work took me deeper into the study of China. After that, we were never in the same city or campus, and I never had the chance to learn directly from him. I managed to read some of his best-known writings, but could not keep up with the latest development of his ideas. What is clear is that his critical approach towards the social sciences has gained wide attention, and his contributions to the sociology of knowledge are well respected. When I was asked again to give the memorial lecture, I felt I should not miss another chance to remember the Hussein that I knew. I have fond memories of the years we were together at the University of Malaya, at the campus in Kuala Lumpur. There may be something of interest in what we shared together some 60 years ago. Our world then was so different, and it might be instructive to look back at what we thought was possible and desirable at the time. I thought I would briefly record the issues that we were concerned with and have had many conversations with him, which made me conscious of what I had taken for granted and led me to think differently about what was happening, even at the time. That is the least I can do for someone who not only had an original mind, but was also keen to impart what he knew to those who found his questionings enlightening. So I hope that what I have to say will not disappoint those who know Hussein much better than I do. Hussein and I met when our university was seen as a place where students were being trained to serve the new nation that was being built, and the teachers were encouraged to embark on research that would contribute to that process of nation building. We met in 1962 when he joined the Malay Studies department and I was in the history department. It was a time when nation building was the subject of many of our conversations. We were both young and were aware that we came from different backgrounds. Hussein's family had deep roots in the region with links with aristocratic leaders. My father, however, had come from China as a professional educator with every hope to return home to China as soon as he could afford to. So, however, we also found that we had a few things in common. We were both born in Java, and in Malaya, we studied in government English schools in sovereign Malay states under different degrees of British protection. He in Johor and I in Perak. That meant that we were not really full colonials like those who were born and brought up in the Straits settlements. Nevertheless, most people in these protected states accepted that the British were more advanced and that in their administration and in their financial institutions. As for the British, their primary interest was in the exploitation of Malaya's resources. Their idea of protection was part of a civilizing mission to bring modern capitalism to backward places. Hussein and I had different experiences in our higher education. He went to Amsterdam, while I headed for Nanjing in China. Both universities had been through terrible wars. Amsterdam had recovered from World War II and was learning to accept the fact that the Dutch Empire had come to an end. Unfortunately for me, Nanjing continued to suffer from war, this time a civil war that led to the fall of the nationalist government to the communists, and that happened in 1949. And when it happened, life changed course completely for me. I returned to Malaya. I gave up my Chinese passport, became a naturalized federal citizen, and entered the University of Malaya that was founded here in Singapore that year. Hussein had studied in Amsterdam with scholars and former colonial officials who were re-examining the country's imperialist past. Now, that gave him insights to critical perspectives of what was happening in our Nusantara world. Many social scientists in Europe were also debating the larger issue of the capitalist origins of modern imperialism. So Hussein was keenly aware that the nationalist leaders of the Netherlands East Indies had won their independence on the battlefield. He was therefore sensitive to the calls for Indonesia Raya, and in Malaya, on the contrary, in Malaya, he saw that the national elites had different interests and were less critical of the legacy of colonial rule. My second campus here in Singapore was a colonial university at the time. It was established to prepare its students to serve the new Malaya, the new Malayan state that someday would also include the colony of Singapore. As students, we debated about the varieties of anti-colonialism that we saw around us, especially those in the newly named region that the British called Southeast Asia. We looked forward to independence, but were encouraged to believe that our nation should be built on the model of the modern European nation state. To do that, we should oppose the revolutionary methods used by some of our neighbors and by the Malayan Communist Party, the MCP, and instead welcome a negotiated power transfer to local political parties. As someone of foreign origin, I was grateful to be given citizenship in the new federation that was based on my having resided in the state of Perak. The new status enabled me to continue with my studies. I was won over by the learning environment on campus, and after considering other possibilities, I chose to follow an academic career. I was also keen to help in whatever way I could to build this new nation of ours. Years later, Hussein pointed out that what I had signed up for was a civilizing mission that had deep capitalist roots. I recall defending my position by referring to the socialist club that my friends and I had founded. Our members were concerned about the conditions of the country's workers and peasants, the poorer people in the country, but hoped somehow, somewhat idealistically, this would be done through democratic politics the kind of democracy that we expected to have. When Hussein and I met, the university did not have social science departments like sociology, political science, psychology, and so on. So he found a home in Malay studies. I had first noticed his name when the first conference on Southeast Asian history was organized in Singapore in 1961. I had not met him yet at that time, just saw his name, because I was away in London and I was doing some research there that year. So I missed the debate where Hussein took on the heads of the two history departments, both in Singapore and Kuala Lumpur, in the debate about whether it was possible to write an autonomous history for former colonies like Malaya. I recall that those two heads were actually in disagreement on this subject. But Hussein joined the debate by showing that that autonomy was possible and desirable. He pointed out that historical research should be free of colonial values, and a modern scholarship is perfectly capable of doing that. So I was very much drawn to the idea. I had not met him then, but I read about it, and I thought, this is a very challenging prospect. Before my return from London, Prime Minister Tunku Abdul Rahman announced the creation of the larger Federation of Malaysia that would expand the 11 states of Malaya to include Singapore and the 3 territories of North Borneo. I was taken by surprise by the announcement, but also attracted by the attention given to the project. When I was returned and I was elected Dean of the Faculty, I agreed with my colleagues that this new development deserved our collective attention. And the 2 campuses, all our colleagues on both campuses, should take on this task, should cooperate, take on the task of putting together what we knew about this new federation. And so we agreed to do a survey of Malaysia. So I organized a team of 26 authors to do that, and was about to finish the editing of the volume, which we entitled Malaysia, a Survey, just about the time when Hussein and I first met. When I saw him, I was sorry that I had not met him earlier, because I recall apologizing to him that none of the contributors to the section on culture and society in our volume were sociologists. So a great matter of great regret for me at the time. I also discovered that Hussein was interested in the sociology of knowledge, a field totally new to me. This had led him not only to question the assumptions that historians made about the writing of history, but also the imperialist foundations of the social sciences that the modern universities were teaching. He was concerned that the civilizing mission that was built into the nation-state model was leading us to accept the results of Western scholarship without questioning the imperialism behind it. He reminded me that while I enjoyed the anti-colonial debates when I was a student, we were conducting our debate in the colonial language, and the discourse framework was entirely Western and in the imperial framework. And even after Merdeka in 1957, many of us took that for granted. And Hussein pointed out that our anti-colonialism seemed superficial. Therefore, we were unquestioning in accepting the idea that Malaya expanding to Borneo was merely a matter of our own national interest. The volume that I edited on Malaysia gave hardly any consideration to the colonial overtones to that British project. Talking to Hussein led me to ask why the anti-colonial phase of my life was so brief. Following Merdeka Day, we turned away from colonialism, the debates about colonialism, to get on with the task of making Malaya a modern nation state. We took that for granted. The country had a constitution that promised a high degree of freedom in a democratic system based on the rule of law. That's how we saw it. Citizen rights and cultural traditions were protected. And that represented modern civilization. As a naturalized federal citizen, I was fortunate to have been given the chance to belong to this country. And that was why my anti-colonialism was more cerebral than deeply felt. In contrast, Hussein knew about the hard edges of colonial policy in the Dutch East Indies. He was convinced that the British were no different. They seemed more flexible only because there were not enough of them to run every part of their vast global empire and to run them as colonies. Therefore, they dealt with the complex mix of sovereign states by claiming to have been using all their skills to help those states become modern economies. After the Japanese occupation, they faced anti-colonial forces led by the Malayan Communist Party and other nationalists, and they of course took that very seriously. They noted that the Malayan Communist Party had been armed to fight the Japanese by themselves. The British armed them. And the MCP leaders, however, were largely Chinese who were inspired by the communist victory in China. Hence, the post-war Malayan Union gave way to the Persekutuan Tanah Melayu because local community elites feared that being anti-colonial could mean supporting the communists in the eyes of the British. Indeed, many of my fellow students were detained under emergency regulations, and labor leaders, both male and female, who were not local born, were deported. Then as the Cold War penetrated into our region, capitalist ideology had become central to the civilizing mission. Hussein and I knew that the nation-state was a unique political phenomenon that came out of modern European history. The two striking examples that emerged at the end of the 18th century were the products of two very different revolutions. One established a French notion of citizens, French nation of citizens, and the other gathered 13 colonies under the United States into the United States of America. Hussein and I shared the belief that actually the Netherlands had a good claim to be the first example of a nation to be when it emerged from their war of independence against the Spanish Empire. But we also agreed that the other two, the French and the American, had greater impact on how nations became a global phenomenon. Looking back, British territories in the Malay world did stand out as different from their neighbors. The United States negotiated a distinctive Filipino post-colonial relationship, and Thailand had managed to stay sovereign. Indonesia was close to the US example insofar as their leaders fought to create a revolutionary state that owed little to the Dutch colonial model. The Burmese nationalists did not have to fight, not for long, because the British had to leave India. But the borders that they inherited made nation building an extremely deadly matter and still remain so. As for French Indochina, especially in Vietnam, the communists led an anti-colonial armies, and the country's nationalists were caught in an ideological war. All these countries were defined by wars against foreign national empires that, in the end, forced the imperial rulers, the Dutch, British, and French colonials, to return to their own nation states. the former colonies all had to depend on national armies to provide the foundations for nationhood. In contrast, Malaya did not have strong local anti-colonial movements before the Japanese occupation. Among the Malays, there were links with Indonesian nationalism. For the Chinese, the politics of China had been brought into British Malaya, and the colonial government was alert to the growing influence of nationalists and communists who sought support from the local communities. With the Indians, sympathy for India's independence was given full rein when the Japanese brought Subhash Chandra Bose to lead the Indian National Army. And after the war, it was the Chinese-led forces, armed by the British, who claimed to lead the battle against colonialism. Therefore, the British turned to the Malay elites and various Chinese and Indian business organizations to shape a different transition to nationhood, and these included the nationalists of China. Therefore, the anti-colonial rhetoric tended, in Malaya anyway, tended to be muted, even polite. As for voices raised in sympathy with the workers and peasants that were described as exploited by their capitalist employers, theirs were stronger, but this exposed them to the accusation by the British colonial government of being communist sympathizers. It was in that context that Hussein made me conscious that the university lacked sensitivity to the colonial discourse that shaped modern knowledge. We had accepted the expansion across to Borneo with an uncritical mindset. I was led to recall how my friends and colleagues set out to build Malaya into a nation state, but had little time to find out what had to be done. Less than 4 years after Merdeka Day in 1957, we were told that Malaya was to double its size and become Malaysia. I remember that there were doubters about this Malaysia concept from the start. They pointed out that the politics behind the extension to northern Borneo had little to do with the people of the 14 states involved. There was nothing civilizing about adding the 3 territories to the federation. The severest critics saw that the British were pushing for it in order to protect their economic interests. In our conversations, Hussein thought that the accusation that the Malaysia expansion was conceived in a capitalist framework that favored the former imperial powers should not be lightly dismissed. I admitted that as the editor of the volume of essays on Malaysia, I did not acknowledge that interpretation in the book. Thus, through our discussions, Hussein persuaded me that our quest for modern knowledge was far more divided by antagonistic ideologies than I had anticipated. Let me illustrate this further with my experience of northern Borneo. I visited northern Borneo for the first time to find out what the new Malaysia might be like. I explained to Hussein that the question I had asked everywhere I went was whether it was a natural extension of Malaya in everyone's interest, or whether it represented something that was being thrust upon them without consultation. I cannot recall exactly what Hussein said at the time when I told him what I had done. He thought that Malaysia was not something Malaya's leaders had asked for, nor was it what the people of North Borneo wanted. The Brunei Revolt and the Sultan's decision to withdraw from the Federation confirmed that, and other voices in opposition had come from the emerging new group of leaders in both Sarawak and Sabah. In the end, the accusations that it was all a colonial plot came loudest from President Sukarno in Indonesia, and that drowned all other voices. Once confrontasi was raised as an issue in the anti-communist Cold War, that made many feel that they had no choice but to make Malaysia a success. And then, to everyone's surprise, less than a year after its establishment, Malaysia's 14th and richest state, Singapore, felt forced to leave the Federation. I believe that Hussein shared my sense of regret at the time, even if it may have been for different reasons. For me, this was a wasted opportunity and a great disappointment. Our conversations reached out in many directions, even after he left for Singapore to be professor and head of the Malay Studies Department. Hussein always asked probing questions. Those that left the strongest impression in my mind pertain to the nature of the nation state and this civilizing mission to make it a modern one. Certainly the national elites to whom power was transferred believed that the way forward was to use the colonial state to transform the country into a prosperous capitalist nation. Our conversations kept returning to these two issues, and they've both been of concern to me thereafter, even though we never had the chance to discuss them again after we parted in 1968, and that was my loss. I had been trained in Western historiography, and without much knowledge of European civilization at the time. Instead, my teachers concentrated on the European ventures into Asia since 1498 that led ultimately to Western dominance during the 19th century. Then their courses in the university lecture courses were more like how the Europeans brought modern civilization to the Asian peoples. In my efforts to become a historian, I did not find what the Europeans stood for as interesting as how the Asians responded, the Asian responses. I was drawn to read about how various Asian traditions were undermined and subordinated in this civilizing mission of the 19th century. What I would say was imperial capitalism. Because of my background in classical Chinese, I chose to study China in search of answers to the question of why that ancient civilization had succumbed to Western power and finally chose to take the revolutionary path to national recovery. In our history department, several of my colleagues and students were engaged in writing Malayan national history. We thought that the best place to start was the history of the Malay states. For myself, I've been studying how migrant Chinese had settled in various parts of Southeast Asia, and I focused on the history of those who came to the Malay Peninsula. I hoped in that way to make a contribution to understanding the conditions for nation building in Malaya. Hussein was curious about the approach we were taking, and I found it always challenging to answer Hussein's questions about our progress. It was a matter of regret that our conversations ended when I left for Canberra. But the interest he aroused led me to follow, albeit not very systematically, the writings he published thereafter, most notably his challenging study, Thomas Stamford Raffles, Schemer or Reformer, and his analysis of a blatant example of colonial Orientalism, the myth of the lazy native. I have one more story to tell about our common interests. In 1967, Hussein went to head the history at the Malay Studies Department in the University of Singapore, and I accepted appointment in a research school in the Australian National University. Before I left, both of us were approached by Tan Chee Koon, the Member of Parliament from Batu in KL. He was a former leader of the Labour Party who disagreed with the party's deliberate move far to the left and he now asked us to help him establish the party Gerakan Rakyat Malaysia. Tan Chee Koon knew that I was leaving for Canberra and had no interest to be a politician, but I was willing to help him as a friend and as someone who shared his concerns for the country. Like Chee Koon and me, Hussein was no less disturbed by the way the country's communal politics was harming the nation-building project. We were therefore willing to support a new party that cut across the communal divides and focused on the interests of the poorer people who were clearly the majority in the country. We agreed that this issue had been seriously neglected, and one of the reasons why Malaya did not have a strong anti-colonial consciousness. The presence of three kinds of nationalisms, Indonesian, Chinese, and Indian, coupled with the armed wing of the Malayan Communist Party, had pushed the nation project in different directions. What was considered most urgent was for the strong colonial state to unite the people to fight an anti-communist war while seeking compromises that would enable the local elites to find a democratic way towards nationhood. The test came through local elections when two communal parties, UMNO and the MCA, combined to win the most seats. That set the frame for alliance politics, and it produced the leaders who negotiated the final terms for independence. The two national elections in 1959 and 1964 then confirmed that being anti-colonial was unnecessary, and that communal parties who shared the economic interests of the departing colonial power provided a safer way to build the nation state. I went to Canberra in 1968 and was very happy there to hear the news that in the May 1969 elections that the Gerakan Party did well in its first elections. In the midst of the celebrations afterwards, no one expected the riots that followed, the May 13 riots that followed. It was a sad day where many lives were lost and the country saw a rejection of the non-communal alternative that a sizable portion of the electorate had indicated that it preferred. In the years following, what emerged was a different kind of nation from what I had hoped for. Although its leaders claimed to have been anti-colonial, the identity politics they clung on to owed much to the interests of the former colonial powers. When the Gerakan-led state government in Penang decided to join the UMNO-dominated alliance, Hussein left the party together with Tan Chee Koon, to form a new party. By that time, the communal leaders were creating something more like the narrowly conceived European nation states that were based on the interests of a local majority with lower status given to minorities and people of migrant origins. Implicit in the new formulation was that some citizens were more equal than others. I was shocked. I could not support the idea that citizens may not be equal. Therefore, I was happy to see that Hussein stayed true to what his party Gerakan had stood for. And in particular, I was impressed by his continued dedication to questioning the way the civilizing mission of the nation state was conducted through the discourse of the former imperial powers. Hussein's leadership of the original party Gerakan Rakyat Malaysia that he founded deserves admiration. The party's political fortune and ultimate fate raised questions about how difficult it was to build a nation out of a colonial framework. However, when Malaya's leaders encouraged their political parties to fight primarily for each community's interests, Hussein would agree that the nation building was given a false start, and the nationhood that was that was promised has become more elusive than ever. Let me end with some memories of a relevant, if somewhat esoteric interest that Hussein and I shared. I was teaching a course on theory and method of history, a course that I had taken over from my predecessor. Hussein was curious how I dealt with the issue of autonomous history. I had not joined directly in the debate earlier on. My approach was to examine the different traditions of history writing that the world has had since ancient times, and then unpack the philosophical premises lying behind each tradition. This theory and history course that was taught in many Western universities normally would begin with the work of Greek and Roman historians like Herodotus and Thucydides, Caesar, Tacitus, and so on, some of their notable followers. So I explained to Hussein that how I compared them to the traditions established by Chinese historians like Sima Qian and Gungwu, who anchored historical records to the enduring needs of their own state. In contrast, the Mahabharata, the Ramayana portraitures that infused Indian historical writings for millennia were rich with stories of the gods. So I consulted Hussein about histories based on the Holy Book, in particular the Islamic scholars that histories had inspired. I had been teaching from Charles Isawi's selections from Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah. Hussein knew that Ibn Khaldun's work very well, and he encouraged me to read more to get a better feel of the study of history and the feel of the unity of history and sociology that the Muqaddimah represented in his eyes. And I recall how that inspired me to read Franz Rosenthal's 3-volume translation of Ibn Khaldun's book when that came out. As a result, I was much more confident lecturing on some of Ibn Khaldun's ideas, and I learned to admire him for his wisdom and believe I was able to convince my history students, the honor students that I taught, to appreciate the profundity of his philosophy. Although I never taught the course again after leaving KL, I never lost my interest in comparative historiography. Hussein had given me a greater awareness of the sociology of knowledge, and that helped me to learn about the power of intellectual heritage. Although not completely free of the historiography that I had been trained in, I believe that my conversations with Hussein some 60 years ago enabled me to avoid being totally enslaved by it. For that, I am most grateful. Thank you for listening to my memories of Hussein. You can now see how much I appreciate being given this chance to commemorate his memory, to remember him to you all. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Professor Wang. We would now like to commence the question and answer session. For this, I would like to invite Professor Syed Alatas of the Department of Sociology and the Department of Malay Studies to the floor to moderate the session. Dr. Nur Shahril, Senior Fellow of the IC's Yusuf Isha Institute, will help to manage questions from Zoom.
Thank you, Hanisa. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very honored to moderate this session. Of course, it's a special honor for me, not simply because, of course, because it is it has to do with Professor Wang Gungwu, but doubly so because it's in commemoration of my late father, and I was very touched to to hear. I wasn't actually aware of the types of influences or impressions that my father had made on you. So I was very grateful to hear that from you.
Young.
When you were very young, that's right. But I have to say that although you had parted ways when you had left for Canberra and he had left for Singapore, when in the early days in Singapore, at the residence, the university residences in Ross Avenue, I remember when I was very young, 8, 9, 10 years old, I didn't know what my parents were talking about, but every now and again I would hear Gungwu, Gungwu, Gungwu. So I knew your name even before I knew what you, who you were, and what your work was about. And it was as I got older, I realized I don't think I heard anyone else's name mentioned more than yours. So I think my father also was impressed by your work and carried that memory with him for a long time. So before we begin the Q&A session, I just wanted to say a few things. I'm not going to say too much about Professor Wang's work, because whatever I would have to say would merely be a fraction of the immense work that he has done over the years. But when I was looking at some of your work, I came across a reference to your characterization of America using the Chinese concept of tanxia. I was very interested in that because it seems to me that you were looking for an alternative model with which to understand the role of the US that differs from the idea of American imperialism. You seem to be talking about American domination, but in a way that's different. In a way that's different from what is implied by the concept of American imperialism. And what I find very interesting is that you are taking a concept from Chinese history, from Chinese tradition, but you see it as a universal concept, and you're applying it to a situation that's outside of China. And if my father were alive today, he would say that is autonomous history. That is thinking outside of the framework of colonial Orientalism.
Well, he will use Asabiya to say the same way, I guess.
Yes, exactly. Maybe to begin the session, I was wondering whether you could say a few words about this idea of tanxia and why you think it's a more appropriate concept to talk about America.
Well, to be honest, I didn't directly use tanxia with Americans in mind, but as a young historian and a young man, there was a time when I optimistically said the age of empires is over. That we're nation states, United Nations, hundreds of independent nations, theoretically equal in the eyes of one another. No more empires, no more empires. But as I grow older, I realized that that's a mistake because I'm using the word empires too narrowly. That's only we might say the Latin word imperium is where empire comes from. And so strictly speaking, empire really means that particular kind of empire, which was founded in the Mediterranean. It was not just founded by the Romans, actually it was founded by others. There were Egyptian empires, Greek empires, Persian empires. But the Romans strengthened that in the eyes of the whole of Europe, so that the Roman Empire survived in Europe as an idea, even into the Holy Roman Empire, down to very modern times. And all the empires that were built, especially when the British and the French, and later on the Germans and so on, took this very seriously, they used the Roman experience as the greatest empire ever in the West, as the model for the modern empire. So although the modern empire was different, nevertheless, that was the model. The empires go out, expand, take territories, have colonies, and so on. And that kind of empire is probably over. It's not the time for that, I think, is over. But actually, imperialism in a much broader sense takes many other forms. And then I look through history, then of course there are other people who use that differently, and they mean different things. For example, when the Europeans came here and described everything that was more than a few states was called an empire. And we have the Srivijayan Empire, Malacca Empire, Majapahit Empire, and everything was called an empire. But actually, most of them are very different. I mean, when you look at the Chinese Empire or the Japanese Empire, and you look at the Majapahit or the Srivijayan Empire, there are really very little similarities, because the Srivijayan Empire was not a centralized bureaucratic state that ran lots of territories. It was actually a very mobile, open, and inclusive approach towards the relationship between various different polities. And they moved around. Even the capital moved around. It was really very, you might say, very realistic, highly responsive to different circumstances, and a completely different sense. In fact, that's, of course, an extreme example, opposite to the kind of territorial empires that the Romans represented. And in modern terms, with industrial capitalism, they made it even more efficient, wider, global. And with naval power, it became really global. I mean, the whole world was, at one time, nearly all the world was divided mainly between the French and the British empires, with a few others joining in at a later stage. So that was their concept. So because of that, I felt this word empire used for us. Everything was called an empire. And no difference. The Europeans used the same word across the board. And in their minds, that was an empire. And all empires should be something like the Roman Empire. But then what happened was, and something very strange happened, that these modern empires all ended up with decolonization. And when that meant was, and this is Roman Empire again, is that meant when the empires came to an end, all the imperialists had to go home, back to their own country. The Dutch went home, the French, the British had to go home. And that didn't apply to Asia again. If you look at either the Persian Empire at its maximum, the Caliphate, Arab empires, and the Mughal Empire, or the Chinese Empire, that was not how it worked. I mean, they just behaved differently. They had different ways of integrating themselves and using cultural, religious, civilizational ways of combining in different ways. So there are different forms of imperialism. And not all imperialisms are alike, and you can have different ones. And today we may look at things which we are not even sure about at the moment, but they could be empires controlled by financial controls, globalized financial systems. Globalization can be highly imperial, and you have your multinational companies are completely transnational and cross many, many borders. And this can go on to, I mean, look at some of those richest companies in the world. They are richer than most countries. So there's a different sense of it all. So I began to wonder about this empire having come to an end. So because you're using it in a particular way, but in other ways, there are different kinds of empire. And not all empires are ruthless and just occupying and territorial and so on. So you look around, different countries have different words for it. And this is something that one it's interesting to follow up. So for the Chinese Empire, we used to call it the Chinese Empire, but the Chinese actually don't have a word for empire. They never had that word. What they had was, this area which they used the word Tianxia. The original meaning of Tianxia was actually very vague. It just all under heaven was what it meant literally. But of course, it meant all the world that is known to the Chinese, very limited view. But then when it started to expand itself into what was the Han, the Qin Han Empire, they actually used the word Tianxia to cover what they did. And of course, they didn't have to, they stopped. They had created a territory which shared the same language, the same weights and measures, all the kind of measurements, the same coinage, and the most important thing is that they created a set of rules, laws, and so on, and a bureaucratic system that applied to all the areas that paid taxes to one government. And that's what they call the Tianxia. So that became their Tianxia. But that Tianxia was not the same as the original Tianxia. So today, the word now is very difficult to separate from this Chinese historical background. I'm sorry I'm taking so long about it, but just to show that it really comes from the idea that empires have come to an end, no more empires, is not correct. You have to think in a different way to consider the possibilities of other kinds of empire, which can control us in ways which are not territorial, but it can be much more powerful by control your mind, you know.
So I think some scholars have used your idea of, refer to your work and speak about American Tianxia, where an empire which is not controlling territory, but controlling, not through territory, but through other means, through political economy, through the mind, and so on. For example, Facebook, yes. All right. So I think we should open this up. We have members of the floor if you would like to ask a question or make a comment, and we also have some comments or questions from online. But first of all, Professor Mahbubani.
Thank you, Gungwu. That was fascinating. I didn't have as much pleasure as you had to have as many conversations as you had with Syed Hussein Alatas, but I did have a few with him. And I remember his impish sense of humor and his constant laughter, which is a sort of characteristic of the man. But as I was listening to you talk about your conversations in the 1960s, and at that time, from what even I can recall, the sort of intellectual, emotional direction was, anti-colonial, anti-imperial, anti-Western hegemony, that was the sort of direction. And yet the concepts that were used to justify anti-imperialism, anti-hegemony were also Western concepts, freedom, emancipation, liberty, and so on and so forth. So in your conversations with Syed Hussein Alatas, did you try and resolve this contradiction? On the one hand, the emotional direction was anti-Western, but the intellectual content used to justify the anti-Western direction was Western.
One thing I deeply regret is that my conversations with Hussein were really, at the intensive period, was really about at the most 3 or 4 years. Because before that, we just met each other, spoke briefly, and then after that, he moved to Singapore, and I only saw him when he came up to talk about Gerakan matters. So our conversations did not develop beyond a certain point. I think we could have followed our arguments much further. But, so there are many other things. We're looking back now, I failed to follow up. I mean, my attention moved somewhere else. And in fact, I think Hussein was consistent in pursuing the sort of things that really was in his mind. And he was very thorough. He went right through, never gave up on the kind of questions, very fundamental questions that he asked. For me, I got distracted by my own interest and by the fact that I concentrated essentially on trying to understand one place. And to me, was so challenging and so difficult that I spent my life doing that. So you might say that after I left KL, my worldview was actually, in some ways, narrowed by the fact that I took so much time studying one civilization, that was a Chinese civilization, because I was puzzled by it. I really was. I mean, in fact, the reason why I got interested back in Chinese history again, and doesn't answer your question quite, but I just want to illustrate to you what was the kind of things that engaged me. And Hussein was really different. I realized afterwards, he just pursued something that he really believed in, whereas I got caught up by something that was puzzling to me. The puzzle was a very simple one. How could someone like Mao Zedong and the Cultural Revolution set out to destroy Chinese civilization? It's in a way a very simple question, but I had no answer. I did not understand it. This ancient civilization that had been around for so long, and here was a man who very nearly got the whole population of China to chuck out this ancient civilization and take on a revolutionary path which was very uncharted. Even Mao Zedong did not know where he was going, quite frankly, in the end. He lost his way too. And in the end, nothing came out of it. It was a total, to my mind, in civilizational terms, total disaster. And the Chinese have been trying to find their way back to reconstruct something for themselves in the last 20 or 30 years in particular. But that was what distracted me from many of the general questions which Hussein and I spent a lot of time talking about when we were together. So as I said, I deeply regret that because in a way, by leaving KL, I was actually moving from a very complex and subtle and very miscellaneous, a kind of plural society, into one which was much more monotonous in a Western European, Australian university, where my special interest on China became so focused. So that lost me a lot of understanding, comprehension of the larger picture that, and the very fundamental questions that Hussein kept on asking. I'm sorry, I lost it.
Thank you. Maybe a partial and brief answer to your question is that within Western tradition, there is an anti-establishment, anti-colonial, orientation. And my father happened to, because he was born in Indonesia and some of his childhood was there, he was sent to Amsterdam to study, and the Faculty of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Amsterdam had people who were anti-colonial. So the famous Professor Wertheim, for example, was at one time an ardent supporter of Mao.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
And so I think he got a good dose of anti-colonial orientations when he was in Amsterdam, unlike his colleagues from Malaya, who studied in a more conservative British and a more anthropological tradition. So I think that's part of the answer to your question.
I have a feeling that Hussein actually understood colonialism better than I did, because in a funny sort of way, because I was brought up by my parents to believe that we were going back to China, and I was living in a protected Malay state, unlike Dutch East Indies was really a colony. Straits Settlements was a colony. But the protected Malay states of Perak and Johor and all that were not really colonies. So I could say that I could grow up without ever thinking about a colony. Because as far as I've concerned, I had a sultan. The sultan would come to the school, or the Raja Bendahara would come to the school and represents the state of Perak. And to us, that was the source of authority. So I didn't actually genuinely have a deep understanding of what it meant to be a colonial. So I think that was one of the reasons, at least my excuse for not being deeply anti-colonial. I was sort of cerebrally, just as an idea, but not deeply felt.
Yes, Cheryl?
Thanks, Prof. Wang. Thank you for the insightful talk. So I'm monitoring the Zoom questions, and there are quite a number of them, and I'm happy to say that there are now 240 participants on Zoom, and amongst them is Dr. Chandra Muzaffar, who sends his regards, and he's listening to your lecture as well. So there are a few questions. Maybe I take the first one from Ho Chi Tim. So he thank you, Professor Wang Gungwu, for your talk and insights. So he's asking whether you can expand on the debate during the 1961 conference between Prof. Hussein, Prof. Ken Trigoning, and Prof. John Bastin. He says that Prof. Hussein's 1964 article, Theoretical Aspects of Southeast Asian History, was a direct response to Bastin's inaugural lecture as history chair and remains a good and perhaps underused example of a local response in Southeast Asian historiography. Thank you.
Well, that was a debate which, in one sense, it was conducted by people outside of Southeast Asia, because there were the two heads of department at that time were both expatriates. They were arguing between themselves. For us, within the country, in our own minds, we had no doubt that we would write our own autonomous history. But we had not yet done it, and we were still starting to do it. And the question was how to do it. If you're depending on colonial sources, now this is where the historian's training is very limited, which is why I so appreciated talking to Hussein, because part of the time he was telling me about methods in the social sciences, particularly in sociology and anthropology, which helped me look at historical records in quite a different way. Whereas we were trained by the Western historiographers in their tradition, which was to go to the archives, read the records, and write your history based on the records, which is, in theory, perfectly correct. But the fact is that those records were the records of the colonial powers. They were kept records of what they were doing. They were justifying what they were doing. They included things that they were interested in, things that they did not interest in or of no value to them, they would ignore and leave out. If you depend entirely on their records, you are bound to come up with a colonial version of the history. And they say, well, you read it against the grain and try and read others. But that doesn't work very well, because if you depend on those written records kept by the in the colonial archives, you're bound to be caught by it. So you can't help it. So that was a fundamental weakness in our training. So we had to, in a way, relearn the whole thing. So many of the historians later on discovered they had to take up other social sciences to have a better idea of the limitations of their own techniques and skills, and to avoid being caught up by the people who keep the records. And for example, my students who were working on the Malay states found it extremely difficult, because many of the Malay states under protection, the records are actually kept by, in the British way, although the system was a sovereign state under protection. Many of the records, if you depend only on the records, you will not get the full picture. So we had to develop methods like oral history to send our students around to go and talk to people in authority, down to the ordinary man, to see how they lived, what did they think of the system, and so on. So it took us a long time to learn new methods. So the historians actually had to relearn and learn from the anthropologists in particular, to relearn how to reach out, to find another way of looking at our own history and not just depend on the colonial records. And that was not as easy as we thought.
I think it's very interesting that you see the value of the sociology of knowledge, which you had heard about from my father, for historians and for the writing of history, which is extraordinary. I think that you see that as an historian, because I remember a few people. One of them recently, Kwa Chong Guan, he was relating that he was told by historians here at the University of Singapore that Syed Hussein Alatas' work on Raffles cannot be taken seriously because he's not an historian. He was a sociologist. So, first it was Mrs. So before we go on to the next online question, maybe we will have Mrs. Zainal Abidin and then Prof. Mazna.
Thank you. Thank you, Prof. I'm not a historian either, but I was a student of Professor Syed Hussein Alatas. I have a question on multiracialism, Malaysian Malaysia, and the challenges of race politics. But before that, Prof, I was very surprised to hear you say that Chinese, there's no such word as empire in the Chinese language, Tenxia, when you're talking about Tenxia. And I think we know that when we talk about empire, we have to look at the unconventional, including Facebook. I was wondering what Tencent will be about when it comes to empire building. But back to the question about multiracialism. See, I was a student of Professor Hussein Alatas, and I must say that, you know, a lot of what I believe in terms of multiracialism, multiracial harmony, was actually colored by Professor Hussein's thoughts. And in those days, we were very concerned about what kind of Muslims do you want to be, especially in a multiracial context, especially in the global context. And in Singapore, in Malaysia, and in Indonesia. So we had formed PERMIAT, Persatuan Mahasiswa Islam Asia Tenggara, which actually finally collapsed because Malaysia, Indonesia, and even Singapore could not agree on that. So in your conversations with Professor Hussein, you mentioned earlier, Prof, that you regretted that, you know, you left Malaysia with such a complex country when you went to Australia, Canberra, looking at China. So my question is related to that, and whether you could share with us about your understanding from Professor Syed Hussein, what were his thoughts about this multiracialism in the context of Malaysian Malaysia? I think he joined Gerakan was partly because he believed that UMNO politics, Malay dominance, Ketuanan Melayu, are all very fallacious and will be disastrous for Malaysia. But we see now what's happening in Malaysia. If you excuse my expression, it's really in a mess, and it's partly because of race politics. Political parties are actually fighting on concepts which I think are untenable. So how do you see that multiracialism, Malaysian Malaysia, Singaporean Singapore, if you like, or Indonesia, and what were his thoughts that actually pushed him to go into Gerakan? Is it because of these concerns about Malaysian Malaysia and bringing about racial harmony in Malaysia? Thank you.
Well, that's really a very difficult question. It really calls upon the whole history of the Malay world, the Nusantara world. So there is a history of Nusantara, as it were, the whole of the Malay world, and how it was cut up by the imperial forces in new territorial boundaries were worked out in modern times. Those boundaries were not there before. So we are operating, in fact, whether we like it or not, we are operating, in fact, with maps drawn up by imperial powers, particularly in our case, between Britain and Holland. That's what the map was. Because I think the history would be very different if there had not been for the Anglo-Dutch Treaty, drawing up down the Straits of Malacca and even eastern Malaysia, and how all those individual stories of how each of those borders were drawn up were, in a way, completely arbitrary, depending on interests of people who are not continuing to live here. Those empires were like, they did what they wanted, and when the thing came to an end, they all went home, you see. So, but they're left behind, however, we have to live with. So the Malay world was a particularly complex one, because if you look at the mainland of Southeast Asia, those borders were closer to what they were before. In other words, they may disagree between, say, Thailand and Burma here and there, between Cambodia and Vietnam here and there, but they were more or less the ones which were already there because of the river valleys and the mountains in between. And so they had trouble, and Myanmar is still in big trouble, but at least they were known troubles. They were always in trouble anyway. They were something that they inherited from their own traditional history. But the Malay world was, in that sense, you know, the Malay world up to the 18th century and the Malay world after the 18th century was very different. And the kind of pluralism that occurred in the Dutch East Indies, for example, is very different from the pluralism of the Malay Peninsula, and Singapore in particular was very exceptional. Even today, we have to say, I know I used this word many times before, and my friends sometimes object to it, that Singapore is unique in a particular composition of its migrant populations and so on. It's unique because there's nothing else which can compare to Singapore. But the Malay states also, how did they become the way they were? I mean, that is why, when you think about it, had there been an Indonesia Raya, all these Malay sultanates would have gone from day one in 1945. I mean, they were just one. But it could not happen because between the British and the Dutch, they dealt with the two parts separately. And in that sense, the aristocracy of the Malay states depended on the British to save them from the Indonesian Republic. I mean, otherwise they would have been gone. I mean, like all the Malay states in the Sumatra or Borneo or elsewhere, they were all gone. So to save themselves, they had to depend on the British. And so this is a very peculiar situation. So in fact, the whole thing is a product of this colonial period. So even when we are anti-colonial, we have inherited many of the problems that were left behind by the colonial. The very nation, the idea of nation state is left behind by the colonial powers. Because why did we all try to solve it through the nation states? Because we saw the nation state as the most powerful modern political unit created in the world. Because they showed that as a nation state, all those European nation states, they had sovereignty, they had certain rights, and certain recognized sense of identity, sense of belonging, and so on, the citizenry of each of the country. We saw that as modern and something we all would like to achieve. But that was actually not our model. It was never like that before. We were subjects of rulers, and when we were subject of a ruler, it didn't matter what ethnicity you had. If you're a subject of a sultan or a king, you can be of different ethnic origins, even possibly different religions in the old days. But a nation state is different. Once you look at the example of the French Revolution, a French citizenry, then every Frenchman is more or less alike. Same education, same background, same cultural values, and they must share all that, and then they have equal rights. Then the idea every citizen is equal became very appealing. I mean, as I mentioned earlier on, I mean, many of us took to the idea of nation state because we looked at the Western models. Every citizen was equal in that nation. But you have to be a nation first, in a way, before you're a real national and you're a citizen, your rights are absolutely equal. At least that was ideal. In reality, of course, it never is quite so simple. But that was why we were drawn to the idea of the nation state. We thought, end of empire, all empires will end up with nation states. And this is, in a way, part of the tradition that we all inherit today. When we look around and say, no more empires. Every empire must be broken up to be nation states. Look at the Soviet Union. I mean, at the end of all that, the Soviet Union broke up into how many states? And even Yugoslavia broke up into how many states? And even Czechoslovakia broke up into two. To me, rather very mysterious to me, impossible to understand why the Czechs and Slovaks, who are very similar in many ways, broke up into two, but arguing in terms of nation states. So that there's a kind of narrowness in the nation state concept, which we thought was modern, a very powerful unit, will make us strong, we can have a strong central state, and that state can shape the destiny of a nation. And in the Malay states, it's very simple. I mean, I recognize it for what it was, because I knew many of the members of the aristocracy in Perak and the higher civil service, and they were very grateful to the British, because they knew they would go on if it was part of Indonesia Raya. So when you look at that, all the contradictions and ambivalences that in that that broke up, that made clear that Malaysia and Indonesia had to be separate and remain separate to this day. That was there. So you can imagine what it was like to have so many other minorities, migrant peoples who come in, mix up there. And as I said, in theory, it could have worked because the sultanates don't have to accept, they don't have to limit yourself to what ethnicity you are or what religion you have. Rulers can do it if they had the power. But Malaysia was even more complicated. It was a bit of both. There's a conference of rulers, but there's also parliament and all the constitutional rights of a powerful political party in charge. And as you know, even recently, the conference of rulers get drawn into politics now. I mean, that was total surprise to me, and it complicates the matter. So I would say Malaysia is still work in progress. I don't know how it's going to develop in the future. So in that sense, as it turned out, separation of Singapore was a blessing for Singapore. I can't imagine what Singapore would be like today if it was part of Malaysia.
I was told that we are supposed to end soon, but in line with the theme of our discussion today, my father would have been very irritated by this. He was always, irritated when the conversation had to be cut short, and he called the people who were trying to cut the conversation short party poopers. He always used the term party pooper. I think we have to we'll take a couple more questions, one from Prof. Mazna and then one from the Zoom. Diana.
Thank you, Prof. Wang. Well, in interest of time, I think I'll make my question very short, because I think you have kind of brought up the issue of the nation state. So that's basically what my question is. Has the nation state outlived its usefulness? That's one. And I think I would like appreciate your thoughts on this in the same vein that you were talking about the question of the empire. So I'm just wondering, as you yourself has articulated about some of the problems, whether it's got to do with multiculturalism or racism or even the migration crisis today, is it because of the inability of the nation state to resolve this problem? But the only problem now, or the real problem now, is that we do not have the means to dismantle the nation state. So just your thoughts on that.
I didn't hear that quite clearly.
The relevance, is the nation state still relevant? The nation state.
Is it right?
Is it still relevant?
Has it outlived its usefulness?
Well, ever since I was a young student, I believed in the nation state at that time. So I find it very difficult to shake off the idea. So I actually, you can say that I actually grew up in the sense of wanting to be a nation. And it's not only just for Malaya. Looking around, everywhere, everybody wanted to be a nation. So I've taken that as, in a way, for granted. But I know that every now and then, I do have question marks about its future. And the reason is it's a very complex one. Someone like Kishore would understand it better than I do. It's about the very structure of the United Nations, this global governance idea, based on the idea that every nation state was equal to every other, which as an ideal, it's wonderful. For small states, if there's a guarantee that we are equal to the big states, that's wonderful. It makes us very comfortable and safe. But I'm afraid I just don't personally, I don't believe it. I think it's in the end, it's a fiction. It's in the end, groups of small nations have to follow one big nation. The others have been, in a way, kind of satellite or vassals or whatever of a big nation. In reality, I mean, on the surface, you can talk about equal nations, but in practice, you look to who is the more powerful and so on, and you follow, because if you don't, you're in trouble. Or you have to follow the other guy who's more powerful. In reality, that's more like it. And perhaps the only chance, and this is, again, the United Nations proves it, is for all the small states to get together and hang on and develop something which will stand up as a group against the big states. Now that's theoretically possible, but very difficult to achieve, and they're not stable and they don't last long, and the countries' interests move from time to time. A good example is ASEAN, which and many of us here believe in ASEAN as the only hope, only thing that is really going for the 10 countries here is for you to stick together, and you have a chance. You can still play. You have some agency, as it were, as long as you can stick together. But my goodness, it is difficult. I mean, it's so easy for the 10 nations to find something or other to disagree. And testing cases right now in Myanmar, I mean, it's very difficult. Or South China Sea, I mean, it's very difficult for 10 countries to agree on one issue like that, because it doesn't affect everybody, you see. And each one has its own interest to worry about. So even here, you see tremendous effort and all the idealism. I mean, Kishore and others who have experience of it have seen ASEAN grow out of the last 50 years and see how much effort has gone into it, how many thousands and thousands of meetings the top officials have held to try and find way of making sure that we hang together. And still, we cannot guarantee that. It's still very difficult. And this comes back to the question of whether we can find ultimately a better global governance system that will work. And the nation state is only just one small part of it. And the only chance it has, it seems to me, for the small ones to get together and in a way add up enough weight to stand up against the 20 or 30 bigger ones and hope for the best. But I don't feel that optimistic about it being a permanent thing forever and ever.
Dr. Shahril, I think you can read the last question.
Yes, so we have quite a number of questions here, but I'll just try to group them together. I think there's a lot of interest on China's rise, particularly whether it's going to be a benign superpower, especially given its behavior in the South China Sea. But I find this question by Imran Rashid quite interesting, and this is in line with Prof. Alatas' struggle to challenge Eurocentrism and also to build this autonomous social sciences. And his question is, with the rise of China as the new leading superpower, would you foresee a greater challenge to Eurocentric discourses? And I think he's referring to academia. Are we moving towards an autonomous discourse at the global level? Or do you think the Chinese-centric discourse is on the way?
You know, the future of global power is still unclear to me. The globalization that we have experienced in my lifetime anyway, has been fairly obvious, because it was moving from a more continental type of power to a maritime power. That happened at the end of the 18th century. From then onwards, the whole of the 19th century, and even today, that maritime power is the only global power. Continental power cannot be, because you're bound by land, limits of land, and continental rivalries and contestations make it impossible really to have genuine global continental power, as been proven by thousands of years of history. But naval global power is possible, because ever since the late 18th century, the dominance of naval power linking up, truly globalizing, linking up the whole world in the British Empire, number one, followed by the French Empire. Between the two, the British Empire was much more powerful in maritime terms, but between those two, they basically control the world by controlling the seas. They could not control the inland. That's why they had this tremendous difficulty with the Russians, because the Russians provided the alternative. That remains so for now nearly 200 years. And when the Cold War ended in the 1990s and the United States became the sole superpower, I think there was a moment when the United States really believed, and even some of us may have thought of it, but others may have believed too, that they could actually be the sole superpower for a long time, if not indefinitely. And because they thought they controlled the seas, and what they needed to do, having defeated the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc, they now need to control the continent. And they tried. And in a way, if you look at the response to 9/11, it was an attempt to get to control over the continent. The whole question of the Middle East, all the way to Afghanistan, to Mediterranean, to Afghanistan, control of the Middle East. And then there was only left was China. The Central Asia was all small, broken up, the Soviet Union broken up. So I think there was a kind of thinking that if the Russians, if the Americans could control Afghanistan and use the neighboring states of Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan to have their American bases in the war against Afghanistan, they actually had bases for a while. But it didn't work. And the withdrawal from Afghanistan is symbolic in that way, of a recognition that land, continental power was beyond them. Maritime power, however, the hegemony on sea is indisputable. I think there's only global power is maritime power and is American power. American and its allies line up all the navies together. If they're all on one side, nobody can challenge them at sea. And I think this is what is the last line of defense of European dominance or American dominance in the world, is the dominance of the sea. And that is why the South China Sea is so critical, because it's the only area where one power seems to be challenging them in the South China Sea. Elsewhere, there is no challenge. Nobody can challenge American naval power anywhere else in the world. Mind you, I don't believe the Chinese can actually challenge them, but they can make a terrible mess for everybody in South China Sea. But that at least makes the Americans hesitate. This is the one sea that they cannot control, at least not totally. And this affects their whole concept of global maritime power. Whether this can survive as I say, I don't know what the future will like with cyber power up in space and the kind of cyber warfare that you can take place tomorrow. I do not know what will be the future. But as long as it is between continental and maritime power is American superiority is unquestionable. China can never do that because China is a continental power at the same time. It has 14 boundaries between 14 countries. Some of them are hostile, not friendly at all. They have to watch their backs. I mean, the continent is equally important to the Chinese, if not more important in some ways. And you can look at the Belt and Road Initiative. It's a kind of classic understanding of that. To distinguish between the belt to cover overland and the road to cover the maritime, you can see the Chinese mind operating, understanding there's a belt problem overland and a sea problem they have to deal with. Americans don't have to worry about continental power now. Once they know that they cannot control the continent in Eurasia, but they are no continental enemies. They are totally safe in continental terms. Their dominance of the ocean, I would say, within foreseeable future, is almost impossible to see them being defeated at sea. And I think the Chinese are actually aware of that. Their major concern is that their shores are safe and they can never be attacked by sea again, because they learned their lesson. They want to make sure of that. Total defense possible on their own coast, and they would like also to be able to be credible to defend their own maritime interests on the economic side. Their mercantile ships, the merchant marine that they have to need to go to their markets and to get their natural resources, how can they guarantee that? The Americans can block the Straits of Malacca and Straits of Taiwan or wherever it was anytime they really want to. If, of course, they make a lot of other enemies, they won't do that. But the point is they can. and if they can isolate and blockade China at sea, if the Chinese cannot at least have some credibility in the South China Sea, they could actually be squeezed economically, contained, and cannot develop properly if they didn't have that freedom. So this is something that I think we are faced with. I don't think there's any likely change to this basic structure. And the maritime power there is American. So whatever the Chinese rise of China may mean, rise of China is to ensure that China wants to be sure it can never be challenged and attacked or defeated again. I think that's all they can hope for.
Thank you, Professor Wang. I'm obviously not going to, and there's no need for me to summarize anything. I think, although this, your presentation had been around your experiences and conversations with my father, at the same time we have learned something about international political economy and history, which I think was very beneficial for all of us. There's just one remark I would like to make. In most conversations about Syed Hussein Alatas, references would be made to his work on colonialism, his anti-colonial position, his views on racism, his views on multiracialism, and so on. And of course, these are all accurate. But one thing which is less discussed concerning my father, but which was brought up by you, Professor Wang, several times, when you said, for example, when you said that my father had mentioned to you that we had signed up for a civilizing mission in the interest of capitalism. And my father was anti-capitalist. He was socialist. And he wrote on socialism. One of his well-known works, which was written in Malay, Islam dan Sosialisme, has recently been translated to English, and it's, by the way, available outside. So he had a very strong socialist bent, and his critique of colonialism was, at one and the same time, a critique of capitalism. He came up with the term colonial capitalism. So I'm very grateful to you, Professor Wang, for bringing that aspect up. Several times you had mentioned his position against, his critique of capitalism.
Be conscious of it.
Yes, exactly. And I think this is something that when in discussing his work, we need to discuss more of that. That needs to be brought into the discussion on his works as well. So I'm really grateful to you for, for having in a very touching manner, narrated the kinds of influences that my father had on you, which is not only interesting in terms of intellectual history, but also very humbling for us to know, that our father had this kind of effect on yourself, and equally, great scholar. So thank you very much, Professor Wang.
Thank you, and you can see that I remember him very fondly.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Wang and Professor Alatas. I hate to be playing the role of party pooper, but thank you everyone for the questions, and apologies for all of the excellent questions that we couldn't get through on Zoom. We would now like to invite Professor Tan Eng Chai and Associate Professor Mazna Muhammad on stage to present our gift of appreciation to Professor Wang. This exceptional gift is a stoneware pottery, which reflects its rich Southeast Asian origin. The clay is from Peninsular Malaysia. The handle of hard and wicker is from Lombok. And these were put together by our master potter and cultural medallion winner, Pak Iskandar Jalil. Fired at very high temperatures over several days, this artwork reveals the secrets of the material and creativity of the master himself. We are very grateful to Pak Iskandar and proud to present this gift to our esteemed speaker.